Come and study Holy Scriptures with us as Father Stephen DeYoung teaches verse by verse on the podcast The Whole Counsel of God. Father Stephen is a former Protestant pastor and Bible teacher in the Reformed Church, but now an Orthodox priest serving at Archangel Gabriel Orthodox Church in Lafayette, Louisiana.
So we'll go ahead and get started. When we get started in just a moment, we'll be picking up in St. Paul's first epistle to Timothy, chapter 3, verse 1. And so we'll do a brief catch-up introduction. We covered the completely non-controversial part last time. So this is going to be less controversial, and therefore perhaps less exciting from here on out.
I don't know, I say controversy.
Well, chapter 3 is slightly, but not as controversial as the "I command women to remain silent." That pretty much takes the cake for controversial in 1 Timothy. But so this, as we've mentioned now, this is the first of several epistles, several letters from St. Paul that we're going to be reading that are directed towards individuals rather than communities. The ones who were previous to this were either directed to a church, like the Christian community in Corinth, or they were directed to the Christian communities of a region, like Galatia, or St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, that was sort of a circular letter for the area around Ephesus, whereas this one obviously was written directly to St. Timothy. And we've already seen how St. Paul has frequently used this sort of father-son language to describe his relationship to St. Timothy. This and 2 Timothy and Titus are often called the pastoral epistles. The pastoral there, we should really get the idea of sort of mentorship. That's the idea. The idea is that St. Paul is mentoring and preparing St. Timothy for this leadership role in the churches. We talked about how St. Paul is writing this very near the end of his life and during what is likely his second Roman imprisonment. And so he knows that he is nearing the end of his life. And so a big part of the subtext underlying this letter and 2 Timothy is the idea that St. Paul has, of course, been traveling with St. Timothy, mentoring him. They've had this relationship. St. Timothy has sort of served as his messenger and envoy, has been sent to different communities when St. Paul couldn't go himself. And now he's sort of giving St. Timothy his final instructions to really send him out sort of in St. Paul's place, because St. Paul knows he's about to depart. And it's going to be important for what we're going to read this evening, that we understand that this is a transition that takes place at the beginning of the last third of the first century. So around 66, 67, this is when St. Paul and St. Peter are martyred. There were apostles who were martyred before them. The rest of the apostles, other than St. John, are martyred after them, right? But all within the end of the first century. And so now we're in this period where there's a transition from the apostles themselves, the direct witnesses who knew Christ and were his disciples during his earthly ministry and observed all these events, to now their disciples. So the transition from first generation to second generation is happening. And this is part of the reason why what are called the pastoral epistles read a little differently. We talked in the introduction about how some people, because they read a little differently, either want to say St. Paul didn't write them, or, et cetera, et cetera. But part of the reason they read a little differently is that there's a transition in the type of New Testament literature that we get, right? So the Gospels were written after St. Paul's epistles. Right? We've talked about that before. St. Paul's epistles were were among the first things written. Right? And those first things that St. Paul wrote were written to directly to these communities. We've seen how they were about very practical things going on in those communities. They're him continuing his pastoral role in the communities that he helped found, or in the case of like Romans, exercising a pastoral role in a community he didn't found, but in which he had a recognized authority to help them with their practical issues. But now, once the apostles themselves and the eyewitnesses begin to leave this world and this life, now there's a need for them to start putting in writing their testimony, their wisdom, their guidance for the next generation, because they aren't going to be there in person to say that anymore. And this is what the fathers say. This is why St. Mark writes his gospel, right? St. Peter is martyred. St. Mark goes to Alexandria in Egypt, and he writes down what St. Peter had told him. He takes St. Peter's testimony about Christ and writes it down, because St. Peter's gone now. He can't travel and preach and tell about these things anymore. People hear it has to be written down. And then similar thing with St. Matthew's gospel. St. Luke, when he writes his gospel, says, hey, I went and found a bunch of people have written things. I pulled them all together and talked to people, and writes his gospel. And then, as we talked about back when we were going through St. John's gospel, he seems to have been familiar with all the other ones, and in places seems to be deliberately filling in gaps, like deliberately having seen the other gospels and maybe some others we don't even have anymore, says, oh, hey, here's another story, or here's another piece, or here's something else Christ said that I think is important that wasn't recorded in these others, right? But so that accounts for this shift in St. Paul's writing too, right? Because this is why St. Paul now, here at the end of his life, stops writing to communities to deal with the day-to-day stuff. Starts writing to people who are going to be the people who are going to be dealing with that day-to-day stuff, going into the next generation. So the next generation is going to have a living memory of the apostles, right? So the first generation of apostles has a living memory of Christ himself. Second generation has a living memory of the apostles, right? Third generation has a sort of a living memory of them. By the time you get to the end of the 2nd century, you don't really have that living memory anymore, right? And so there's another transition there when you're reading the fathers at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century. There's another sort of transition there where you're now outside living memory, and so it's about trusting what has come before. And this is what then develops into the whole process of tradition, right, within the church. But so St. Paul very much has this in mind as he's writing to St. Timothy. It's not just that he's preparing St. Timothy to take this role. He's preparing him to take this role knowing that he's not going to be there in the flesh, right, to have that role himself. That's very much the case both in 1 Timothy and when we eventually get to 2 Timothy, it's the case there too. So all that said, unless there are any questions or comments or timely reminders, we'll go ahead and pick up in St. Paul's first epistle to Timothy, chapter 3, verse 1. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. Okay. So, first we'll comment on the translation bishop, because this is already something that people will have an issue with. So the word there, episkopos, is the word that's pretty much always been translated bishop in English, right? So we could just leave it in Greek if we wanted to, episkopos, as this office. It literally means in Greek, someone who watches over. And so a lot of times it's translated very literally into English as overseer, right? Which super literal, right? The scopos and episcopos is like telescope, microscope, scope, to see, to look. But that word has behind it a Hebrew word from the Old Testament. It's basically ra'im. Ra means to see, to look or to see. And that word in its noun form referred to a herdsman or a shepherd. Someone who watches over flocks, someone who watches over herds. Right? So this is an adaptation, right, in Greek. It's not St. Paul's inventing a new term. He's inventing a new office. He's like, here's how I think we should structure the church. Tell me what you think, right? It's picking up on this theme, right? We see the leaders of Israel all through the Old Testament are called the shepherds of Israel, right? Whether they're getting chewed out or whether they're being praised, they're called the shepherds of Israel. They weren't always good shepherds, but they were to be shepherds. And so this is the same language. And that's why this gets translated into Latin as pastor, which means shepherd. Right? So they were aware of the root behind episcopos. So that it's a little lost in the English word bishop, right? It's not sort of...
What's the etymology of bishop?
I do not know. That's if Father Andrew listens to this, he can Facebook message me and tell me. He's studying Old English right now, so he could probably let me know. But I am not an English language scholar.
With the episcopos having this shepherd-like meaning, is that the word for shepherd in Greek at this time, or would they have a...
No. No, that is not the normal word for shepherd in Greek.
Okay.
But it's the word in Greek that's used to translate that word for herdsman in the Old Testament. Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't have that other connotation.
Right. There are other words specifically for shepherd in Greek, right? But so St. Paul is taking this word not just out of the Greek language, but very deliberately from the Greek of the Old Testament to refer to this role in the Old Testament. This is important for a whole bunch of reasons, but the biggest one is, as I harp on all the time, we tend to have this idea as sort of modern Western Christians that Christ comes and then the Holy Spirit comes, and it's like, okay, we're starting from scratch, new religion time, right? And that's not how any of the apostles saw themselves. They saw themselves as continuing the same religion they had before. It's just now the Messiah's come, which we were expecting to happen, and the Holy Spirit has come, which Joel prophesied would happen, right? So this is all part and parcel. And so when the apostles are structuring the church, right? I mean, they were leading the church while they were alive, but as they come to the end of their lives, they're like structuring the church going forward. They're not inventing some new structure. They're not taking something, as one of my old professors in Protestant seminary used to say, they're not sort of borrowing the magisterial bishop from Roman civil government somehow. Right? Like, they're thinking like a governor or something. But they're directly continuing. And so these terms, whether it's episkopos, whether it's presbyter, right, which gets translated elder in the Old Testament, right? 70 elders, the elders of Israel, the Sanhedrin were presbyters in Greek, right? All of the structures of Israel in the Old Testament remain as structures of Israel in the New Testament, meaning the church, right? So there's a transition, obviously, because Christ fulfills these things, but they aren't sort of scrapped and some new thing comes and takes their place, right? They're fulfilled and developed, right? So the way St. Paul is talking about that, so a lot of people argued, we talked about this in the introduction, that to this book, that a lot of people, this is one of those things that they'll argue, oh, well, St. Paul can't have written this because there can't have been bishops yet while St. Paul was alive, because they were starting from scratch and it took time for those structures to develop, right? But if you understand that these are structures that already existed, right? So they're putting these into place in a Christian context, right? So we saw in the book of Acts, right, there were presbyters, there were elders of the community in Ephesus. This isn't something St. Paul invented in Ephesus. There was a Sanhedrin back in Jerusalem. There were elders back in Jerusalem who were in charge of the religious community. Right? So it's just, he's applying the same structure. Right? Now these are Christian presbyters, Christian elders, Christian overseers, Christian shepherds, Christian pastors. Right? Distinctly, but it's not any kind of radical departure. So there's no reason why St. Paul couldn't have written this. Right? And all he says here is that this is an establishment. He who desires to be a pastor, he who desires this position of leadership in the church, the leadership of a particular Christian community, desires a good work. Right? Now notice he doesn't say that's just a good desire no matter why they want it. But doing that faithfully is a good work. He's already talked about good works, remember, earlier, right, being zealous to good work. This is one way in which one could do that, is by having this position of leadership in your community. But you then have to be about doing the good work, if that's what you want. It's not just about the authority. Verse 2, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. Okay, so he's talking about, this is the type of person, right, who should have this role. Why would he be telling St. Timothy this? Because St. Timothy is going to be the one who is helping appoint bishops, right, over these churches. So I say these are the kind of people who you need to put into this office.
This may be just because I'm a catechumen and I haven't learned everything.
No one here has learned everything, so you're okay.
Yeah. From what I understand, the bishops these days, though, they have to be celibate and even monastic, I think. So.
Well, sort of. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll get to that in a second. First, the blameless part. Then we'll get to the husband of one wife. So, blameless, right, does not mean they have never sinned in their life, obviously, because otherwise we wouldn't have any bishops, right? The word that's used here for blameless is referring to, blameless is a real literal translation. It refers to public guilt or shame or scandal kind of thing. It's more like they need to be of good reputation, right? This can't be someone who's publicly, seen to be problematic. Yes. And then the husband of one wife, what it literally says in the Greek is he has to be a one-woman man. That's, right. And so this is not meant to imply that he has to be married. This is meant to imply that he can't have been married more than once. Either because he was widowed and then remarried, or divorced and remarried, or polygamous. And people are generally not aware that major Jewish communities practiced polygamy until the 10th century AD. So there were situations. So this is saying none of that, right? Now, in terms of modern practice, we talked about this a little when we read about St. Paul talking about St. Peter's wife and kids. But so the current practice in the Orthodox Church is that because of the nature of the episcopate currently, at this time and in the early church, a bishop was the bishop of a city. And that was it. He presided at that one church in that one city, right? So he was in one place. That eventually developed until as Christianity grew, right? You'd have a place like Antioch, and there would be 7 or 8 churches in the city. And then the little villages surrounding that city would each have their own church. And then, right, so now the bishop is over a whole bunch of churches. And so he would send his presbyters out to preside at the churches he wasn't at, right, for a given liturgy. And now in our current practice, that's grown to these huge geographical areas sometime. Well, in the U.S. it has. In the old country, in a lot of places, it's still a relatively small, the various old countries. But there are hundreds of bishops in Russia. I mean, Russia's a big place, but there's hundreds of bishops over little bits of territory. But so you can look at the U.S. as an example, right? Our bishop, Bishop Nicholas, is headquartered in Miami, Florida, and covers everything from North Carolina to Memphis, Tennessee, down to here in Lafayette, Louisiana, right? And before COVID, as you guys know who've been here, he's traveling every weekend, right? He was in a different place, right? So that kind of lifestyle is not conducive to having a wife and children, right? It has generally been the practice, and I say generally the practice because there are tons of exceptions to this, but it's generally been the practice that for the last several centuries that only unmarried people are elevated to the episcopate. And the best source of unmarried people, obviously, who would be good candidates, are monastics, right? But that is a practice. There have been exceptions to it. And that's also not because there's something wrong with being married. This is something we have to be very clear about. Because it has been very common in those same centuries for for priests who were widowed to be consecrated as bishops. Right? So in our own archdiocese, Bishop John was married and has children, but his wife passed away. His children are all adults and have their own households. And so he no longer had any concerns in that regard that would stop him from being consecrated as a bishop. And so he's now a bishop. So it's the not being married part is a practical consideration. Okay. And it's actually based on that passage we read earlier from St. Paul where he talks about, don't I have the right, if I wanted to bring a wife and children with me, as St. Peter does, right? But St. Paul says, I don't, because he thinks it's better because he's an itinerant evangelist and getting thrown in prison and shipwrecked and all these things, not to do that, right? So it's a practical thing and a question of calling. But St. Paul is emphasizing here, you could only have been married that once, right? Yeah. Tops. And so temperate, sober-minded, good behavior, hospitable, able to teach is good, since that's a big part of their role. Continuing in verse 3, not given to wine, so I think we all know what that means. Not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous. One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? So this is an extension of something we've talked about. In the Old Testament, the concept of priesthood and fatherhood and even masculinity in general are connected at the most basic level. So in the Old Testament, what it is to be a man, essentially, is to be a priest, right, within your household. And so St. Paul is just sort of applying that, right? It's like this: if this man's married and has children, then his first priesthood is to his family, meaning he should be representing God to them and them to God in prayer, leading them in worship, right? And if he can't do that well and successfully in his own household, if there are problems going on in his old house, not just like it's a moral failing, but he needs to be paying attention, right? If his children are having problems, he needs to be attending to that, not going and being a bishop, right? He needs to be focused on that first. If all of that is functioning and all of that is in line and all of that is going well, then he can take on more, he's able to take on more responsibility within the household of God, right? Over sort of the larger family of the community, right? But if that's not okay, his focus needs to be there, right? Not trying to take on more. And yeah, St. Paul is giving really good advice here that all too often we priests don't take. A lot of priests struggle about balancing sort of our own family and the community and having to choose, where do I devote my time and my energy? And a lot of priest families have suffered. And things have not gone well because we don't heed St. Paul's advice here. Verse 6, not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. So novice meaning he's not new, right? He didn't just become a Christian last week, right? But he seems smart and he talks good, so let's make him the bishop, right? Not a good plan, right? But notice why St. Paul says it's not a good plan. It's not like, oh, he's going to do damage in the church, or he's going to teach heresy, or he's going to do incorrect stuff. It's not going to be good for him, right? It's not going to be good for him for you to put him in that position. Because he's going to get proud. Said Kagi, remember how that worked out for the devil. The whole being proud thing. So this is another place where you get that mentorship from St. Paul. Right? That mentorship from St. Paul. That there's a concern, right, for the people who are going to be in these positions of leadership. Right? If them being in that position of leadership, if this person being a bishop, he could seem like on paper the guy who would be the best bishop ever. But if it's going to be bad for his family, then no, don't do it. If it's going to be bad for his salvation, don't do it. Doesn't matter how qualified he is. Doesn't matter how much people like him. Right? These things are more important. Verse 7, moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach in the snare of the devil. Those who are outside the Christian community. So it's not just everybody in the Christian community thinks he's great, right? But the people, why? Because St. Paul's concerned about getting those people outside to come inside. And if having this person as your leader is going to be not conducive to that, that's going to be an obstacle to the gospel, bringing those people into the community, then again, not the right person.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
It goes back to verse 1. We have lots of stories of saints who were bishops, who usually, or very often, the story tells about how he did everything he could to avoid being made bishop.
Yes.
And yet, at the beginning it says, wanting to be bishop is a good thing.
No, he doesn't say wanting to be a bishop is a good thing.
Okay.
He says being a bishop is a good work.
Okay.
Right? And that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're wanting the authority or the power, that's not good.
No.
Right? If you're wanting to serve God, right, and do the work, then that's a good desire to have, right? But right after St. Paul says that, he gives a whole list of things why you might say to that person, hey, I know you're wanting to do a good work, but this isn't the right thing. Right? We just got a whole little checklist, right, of like, maybe not, maybe not, maybe not, maybe not, maybe not. Yeah. So yeah, St. Augustine, they literally drug him to the front of the church in tears to make him a bishop. And they all thought he was crying because he was so honored and touched and having this spiritual experience. And he's like, no, I was terrified. He did not want it. So yeah, there is something to be said for that. But that's not always true too. Like sometimes somebody doesn't want to be a bishop and they're right. You know? Like they know themselves well enough to know that that's not for them. Right? And sometimes someone is the perfect person, and part of the reason they're the perfect person is that they don't want it. Right? They don't want the power. They don't want the authority and stuff. So, yeah, it could go either way. Both of those could go either way. Right? Okay. Verse 8. Likewise, deacons must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. Okay? So, likewise means same goes for, right, for deacons. And I think we talked before about how deacons are roughly parallel to the, back in Acts I think we did, roughly parallel to like the Levites in the Old Testament. Right, you had the priesthood, and then you had the Levites, the other Levites who were not, strictly speaking, in the priestly family, who assisted and did all of these other sub-ministries, right? And that's what we're talking about with deacon. The word deacon is just from the word servant, right? So they're sort of servants. This is a continuation of the household of God idea. They're sort of servants in God's household.
I have a question about that haunts me a lot of the time. Comes up with haunts is digital. But the picture I got from Acts as it was interpreted in the Protestant world that I grew up in was that the deacons took care of money matters, food, practical things like that. Our deacons are mainly liturgical assistants. How did, if that was true of the early deacons, and if it was not, please straighten me out on that. How did that transition happen?
Well, that's the liturgical role of our deacons. But our deacons actually have a larger ministry than that. Okay. Or should. Right? Deacons are actually the ones responsible, and have been throughout the church's history, for bringing communion to the sick, to making sure that widows, orphans, right, people in need are taken care of. They sort of had that external pastoral role. We haven't had yet. Bishops are working on it. But in the United States, we haven't had a very lively permanent diaconate, historically. That's to our detriment. But typically the presbyter would be involved in sort of the internal ministry of the church.
He's a substitute
right.
bishop.
Presiding and that episcopal role. And it's the deacon who had sort of the ministry of mercy to the broader community. So that's more historically, right? And the deacons also have a liturgical role, just like presbyters have a liturgical role. And because bishops have a liturgical role. Technically presbyters don't really have a liturgical role, I should say. Bishops and deacons do. And presbyters do the parts that whoever isn't there would do most of the parts. So, like, if there's a bishop and a deacon at a liturgy, the priests just sort of stand there. The bishop is usually nice and throws us a bone, has us do a couple of prayers here and there, but he doesn't have to. They're not really our parts. He's just sort of being nice so we don't fall asleep. So that's the liturgical role, but that isn't supposed to be the whole role of the deacon any more than doing the services should be the whole role of the priest in the community. Yeah. So he says, likewise. So all that goes for deacons. He reiterates some of it. Verse 10, but let these also first be tested. Then let them serve as deacons, being blameless. Right? So that blameless it's the same word, but it's referring to the testing. Right? Meaning you don't just this is a nice guy. He seems like a good kid. Let's make him a deacon. Right? He cares about people. But they also have to be, right? And for the same reason, right? St. Paul sees not only if you do this with the wrong person, is this going to be bad for the community, but it's going to be bad for the person and for the person's family and for everybody involved, right? So there's testing first. Okay. And now we get to what will probably be the actual controversial part of tonight's Bible study. Because verse 11 is translated completely wrong. So you notice there's some italicized words there. And there's also the word wives. That's not what it says. It says women. Likewise, women. There's no there, and there's no wives. Likewise, women, reverent, not slanderers, temperate, faithful in all things. Okay? Why is this important? Because it's talking about deaconesses. When you look at early church orders like the Didache, okay, deaconesses are not women who are deacons. Deaconess is a separate office. It is a separate thing. Okay? That's why you notice St. Paul introduces it with another likewise. He says, likewise deacons, likewise women. Right? So when he shifts from one office to the next, he's using that word likewise. But the word he uses there for women is not the word for a wife. That's why I say it's mistranslated. It's yineki as opposed to yini. Yini is a woman or a wife, like a woman. In the same way that there's a Greek word anir that means a man or a husband. There's also anthropos that means man like humanity, like mankind. Right? When you have yineki, that means woman, right? Like womanhood, womankind, right? So this isn't the word for a woman or a wife, right? That's part of how we know both that he's not talking about wives and that he's not talking about just women who are deacons, right? Because if it was just women who are deacons, it would have been the other word, right? But in the early church orders, like the Didache, when they talk about deaconesses, there's not a word that's translated deaconess. It's literally deacon women. And it's this word for woman. Right? So there's deacons, and then there's deacon women. Right? And when you read those early church orders like the Didache and the Apostolic Constitutions, they have, here's what deacons do. Here's what deacon women do. Different things. Right? Because this is a different office. So this is the ancient office of deaconess, which still technically exists in the Orthodox Church. It's just not used very much. Some abbesses of convents are actually deaconesses. Have actually been made deaconesses by the bishop. But that's about it in today's Orthodox world. It's just fallen into disuse. And I think there's some trepidation. So there's... Might as well. It's going to be controversial anyway. So There's a lot of dialogue about this right now in the Orthodox Church. Why is there dialogue about it? Well, on one hand, the reason they had deaconesses was that there were things culturally that it was inappropriate for men to do. Right? So at a certain point in church history, people were baptized naked. Going down to the water with a naked woman is not something that male deacons were supposed to do. Right? So women would do it. Visiting unmarried women in their homes to bring them communion was not something it was good for men to do, right? There were, all of these things where socially this wasn't good. And so you had specific women, usually older women, usually widows, originally over the age of 60. They later lowered that to 40. That's the minimum age. And there were specific women who were given that job to help teach younger women, to help prepare women for baptism, to visit women in their homes privately, right? So, on one hand, we're kind of in a similar situation today, right? Where there are a lot of problems in all churches, it's not just other churches, that result from accusations being made and things looking inappropriate of male priests and male deacons meeting with women alone. There's all kinds of problems with that, right? So on the one hand, you have that, and so you have some bishops and stuff saying there might be a need to set aside, certain women to at least help with some of this stuff, to prevent public scandal, to prevent, these things, and to have this ministry. On the other side, you have people with an agenda who want women deacons, as in they want women to get ordained as deacons and do the liturgical deacon part in the service and go behind the altar and do all of that stuff, right? And obviously none of our bishops are going to do that, right? So our bishops aren't going to do that. But so that creates this awkward quasi-political tension where the bishops are in this situation where it's like, well, okay, we can see the use for this, but how do we do it without it looking like something we don't want it to look like, without it being used as people trying to use it as some kind of stepping stone to try and do something else? How do we do it in a way that's appropriate, that actually fills this need of the church, but that isn't going to be seen as something else, right? Or as leading to something else. And so currently the Orthodox Church is sort of on the horns of this dilemma. And so because of that, nobody's really making deaconesses, even though, at least hypothetically, any Orthodox bishop could at any point make someone a deaconess if they wanted to. So yeah, that's kind of where we are. But that's who St. Paul is talking about here. Right? And this shouldn't be that controversial because we already saw Phoebe the deaconess. We've seen people referred to as, women referred to as deacons back in the book of Acts and at other places. But that's what he's talking about here. But since this is the New King James Version in our Orthodox Study Bible, well, we know who translated it. So, that's, yes, sir.
Does a man have to be married before he's ordained a deacon?
Yes. Yeah, the practice in the Orthodox Church is that deacons and priests get married before. This is, again, a practical concern. You don't want clergy to have kind of a weird dual relationship in their congregation, like with their single female congregants. That's bachelor priest is not a good call. And I say this as someone who was a Protestant pastor while unmarried. I won't go into stories here, but the church is wise in that regard. Did you have another question?
I did, I forgot.
Okay.
And I feel like you'd have to manage to wrangle the bishop in to even do a marriage ceremony if a priest is involved.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so yeah, St. Paul isn't directly addressing that here, but yeah, that's one of those practical wisdom things. Okay, and then verse 12, let deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children in their own houses well. We already talked about same thing. Bishops, for those who have served well as deacons, obtain for themselves a good standing and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus. Okay, notice, again, those who have served well. This is like that desiring a good work, right? That actually has to actually be accomplished, right? So notice that St. Paul is not operating under some kind of clericalism here, right? Where somehow the fact that you've been made a bishop or the fact that you've been made a deacon gives you some kind of special standing with God, right? He says basically, yes, if you're a faithful deacon or bishop, that will give you good standing with God. But if you're an unfaithful one, you'd be better off never having that office. Yes, sir.
Absence of presbyters here.
Yes. They'll pop up later. And then they'll go to
Okay.
epistles.
But it
Yeah.
seemed logical that they would
Yeah.
be in this section.
So in these pastoral epistles, and you even see this throughout the end of the first century, when this transition is taking place, where the terms episkopos and presbyter are used almost interchangeably sometimes. I say almost interchangeably because we never have a case where there's more than one episkopos in a city. Whereas there are plenty of cases where there's lots of presbyters in a given church. Right? So it's not completely interchangeably. But in like Papias, for example, who is a first century writer, he refers to the apostles as presbyters sometimes. Right? And the idea there is that, and this is still true in the church, is that a person who is ordained to one office still holds the other offices. Like, I'm technically still a deacon. Right? I didn't give up the diaconal role to become a priest. Right? And so a bishop is still a presbyter.
Still a priest.
Right, yeah. He still has all of that plus, right? So it's addition, not a lateral move, right? And so that I think is part of why, but also while the apostles are still around, right? You have the apostolic office, right, which is its own thing. Once the apostolic office is gone, very quickly by the end of the first century in St. Ignatius's epistles, you have very clearly distinguished episkopos, presbyteros, right, diakonos, right? You have the three offices very clear. But while the apostles are still there, right, the bishops are basically coming in. They don't become apostles, but they are the ones who occupy this successor to the apostles' role.
So they are like substitutes for the apostles, the way presbyters will eventually be substitutes for bishops.
Right. Right. And so while the apostles are still alive, they have kind of a different role than they will come to have once the apostles are all gone.
Listen next time as Father Stephen DeYoung continues his study of the Scriptures on the whole counsel of God. Father Stephen's email address is wholecounsel@ancientfaith.com. That's wholecounsel@ancientfaith.com.